Welcome. This is our fourth Nights at the Museum presentation, and we're glad to have you here with us tonight. One of the first things I'd like you to do, again, as always, is please silence your cell phones. So if you got them, shut them off. We're so happy tonight to have Dr. William Kalsbeek here to educate and entertain us. Dr. Bill was born in Orange City and lived in Alton in Orange City. He graduated from MOC High School, graduating in 1964. He then attended Northwestern College and graduated in 1968. What many of you may remember is that Bill's dad, Gerard, was the town crier for many years in Orange City. And I'm sure that helped to influence Bill as far as his love for the Tulip Festival and his participation in it. Bill earned his PhD in biostatistics from the University of Michigan in 1973. From there he moved to North Carolina, where he worked at Research Triangle Institute for 5 years. He then joined the Faculty of Biostatistics in the School of Public Health at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He taught and directed a survey research laboratory at UNCCH for 36 years before retiring his faculty position in 2014. He continues as an emeritus member of the UNCCH faculty. He is married to North Carolina native Rebecca Talon, and they have 2 married children. In 2011, Rebecca and Bill decided to become a part-time resident of Orange City, for which we're very grateful. The Tulip Festival Steering Committee accepted his proposal to prepare the book celebrating our Dutch heritage, the story of Orange City Tulip Festival, for the 75th anniversary in May of 2015. Now, one other tidbit that you may not be aware of, probably some of you are, but Bill is quite a musician as well. He was one of the founding members of the West Side Four. And in that group, he sang and played the string bass. And if you ever have an opportunity, you should hear them play. After all that, I'd like for you to welcome Dr. William Kalsbeek.
Thank you, Al, for a very nice introduction. The first thing I want to do is a sound check. I want to make sure everybody in the back can hear me okay. Raise your hand if you can hear me okay. Okay, I see thumbs up. So I'm figuring that we're good. This whole business of doing a talk about the Tulip Festival was sort of negotiated, and we had to think about what aspect we wanted to talk about. My book, covers from its origins and goes all the way through to the present, talking about all facets of the way the Tulip Festival operates. And I must admit to you, the most fascinating part of that history that I developed had to do with the origins of the Tulip Festival. Why did it start in the first place, and how did it evolve? And so when we were talking about me giving this talk here, it became quite obvious to me soon on that talking about the origins and the first 15 years or so of the festival will be a good one to talk about. So I hope you'll find that topic interesting. A couple of things I'd like to mention before I begin. First of all, Al alluded to the book that we did with the Chamber of Commerce. Virtually everything I'm going to talk about and show you tonight is in the first chapter of either this book or this other volume that I produced. Now, most of you probably don't know about this volume. This is sort of my first draft, if you will, and we had to cut a lot of the words out to fit it into the book. So this is what I might refer to as an unabridged version. It has a lot more text and a lot more detail as a result, describing various aspects of the festival. Now, This is not something that is for sale and competing with the Chambers version, but rather it was something I felt was important for us to put into the town library. So every library in town, from the town library to the college library to each of the school libraries, elementary, middle, and high school, have at least one copy of this. And I did that for a reason that I will divulge to you. Is one of the main reasons that I felt compelled to write this history. It was certainly for people like yourself, where we can reminisce on things, because a lot of you, when I'm talking, will remember some of these things that I mentioned. But the future of the Tulip Festival are in our schools right here, and I felt that it was very important that what I did was available to them as well. And so that's why we have the second volume. Now, the second thing is that when I agreed to do this, I made it pretty clear that I didn't want it to be just me standing up and spouting for an hour. You know, that's never been really of interest for me to do anyhow. I like interactive things. Now, this is not gonna be a kumbaya hour, but it is gonna be an hour where I'm going to toss out a few quiz questions. No papers graded or anything like that, but there'll be questions about sort of some quirky parts of the early years that at least I thought might be interesting to raise a question to see if you know about them. So there'll be 5 of those that are sort of scattered into my presentation. And then once I finish the presentation, I'll give you the answers, okay? So be thinking about those quiz questions when they come up. All right, so let's begin here. All right, so we have to begin by talking about the settlement of Orange City. We all know about that, how people came from Pella around 1870. And the people who came were immigrants. They were part of the second wave of immigration of Dutch people to this country. The first one had happened in the early 1600s, and most of those people became traders and settled in the East, and found Manhattan, what was New Amsterdam before it was New York. The second wave came about for a variety of reasons, among which was the fact that the Dutch farm economy was struggling in the mid-1800s. And so what happened was a lot of the people who were engaged in farming were not getting good grain prices. And so they began to think, well, you know, maybe we need to look elsewhere. Well, grain prices and farming and the Homestead Act had happened in America. So this became a real source of attraction to those people. And so they came. They came because they sort of were compelled to come, but yet a side of them said, you know, I really don't like to leave this place. There were a lot of things that they liked about the culture. And so as a result, people settled in America and eventually came to Orange City from Pella. And they still had favorable memories of life in the Netherlands. And so their lives in Orange City often reflected a lot of the things that you'd see in the Netherlands. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And those are the vestiges that I'm talking about. I'll spend the first part of my talk talking about what I call the spark that led to the festival. You know, I'm always fascinated with any sort of social enterprise that causes it to happen in the first place. And with the festival, it was no exception. There was something that had to happen, some things that had to come together that would cause people to want to form and to do and to produce a Dutch culture celebration in Orange City. And that was true in Orange City, as we'll see too. Then what we're going to do is to spend a little bit of time looking at how, from the first experiment in the first year of 1936, how the festival evolved in the late 30s and 1940s. So that's basically the essence of what I'm going to talk about tonight. Okay, so I'm going to show you a few slides. I'll talk with you for a little while, and then I'll show you a whole bunch of pictures. Okay. Now this one is of the De Cook and Brink hardware and shoe store in Orange City. And the thing I call your attention to is what's underneath that counter there. What do you see there? They're wooden shoes, right? Now this photo, as best I can tell, was taken before 1917. So we're talking about the early decade or so of the 20th century. And here you see wooden shoes that people would have been wearing. And of course, as you might suspect, and probably knew some people when you were growing up around here, that there were some people, especially the older Dutch, who had gardens. When they worked in the garden, that's exactly what they wore. The Dutch wore them because it kept their feet dry, when they were doing their work. So keep in mind those wooden shoes. Now, it's a little hard to see, but I'll tell you that the style of wooden shoes definitely varies. And why it varies, probably partly to do with the craftsman, perhaps where that person was trained. But these shoes that you see on the bottom, they have little points on them. Okay, just keep that in mind because it's going to come up later. Okay, another thing that you saw in Orange City were windmills. Not a lot of them. You probably had some windmills that were in people's backyards, some miniature windmills. There was a very large one in Orange City that was run by a man named Hyman de Hartog. Now this mill, which was located about the place where the Northwestern College Theater is right now, right at the, at the intersection of K64 and Highway 10, this windmill is a grist mill. It was used for grinding grain. If you're a little hard to see, but there's some animals there in the building next to it. I try to estimate what I thought maybe how high those vanes were on that windmill. And there was probably something in the order of 50 or 60 feet. So this was a pretty large structure that when you were driving to Orange City coming from the east, you could see it for a lot of miles. And this was recounted in different places that I read. Now this was built in 1876, and interestingly, it only this company, the milling and use of it for milling only lasted for about looks like about 7 years. So it wasn't used on and on for reasons I don't fully understand. But windmills were part of the landscape as well. Flowers were there too. Lots of flowers, especially in the vicinity of where we're sitting tonight. The location of the Sioux County Historical Museum is precisely where a place called Slagle Lumber Company used to be located. Now, those of you who grew up in Orange City probably remember that Slagle's was there. It was run by a man for many years named Ed Beloit. And Ed Beloit was well known as being somebody who loved flowers and grew a lot of flowers. And you can see in this photo, this is probably taken right at the curb on, let's see, what is the street here? I can never remember. It's Arizona on here, right? So it was probably taken on the curb on Arizona facing east. And you can see FM Slagle in the background. But you notice also a whole bunch of flowers that Ed Beloit had planted. And now, and Ed, in this picture, seen with his wife Sue, lived in the house that was the first house south of the property here. This is where he lived, and you can see also along the curb, again, the flowers, and mostly tulips. So if you drove through Orange City in the early 1930s, you would see, when you went past Slagle's, you'd see a lot of flowers. You'd also see flowers in some of the yards of some of the people in town, but not everywhere like you see today. Okay, so now I'm going to really focus on what was the spark that made this happen. Now, it's always a little controversial when you don't have direct knowledge from the people who were involved, but rather have to rely on accounts that are published. I feel pretty confident in what I'm about to tell you about how the idea of the festival was actually contrived. It was the version of the story that I'm going to describe to you was in a couple of publications, one by James Trineman, the newspaper publisher in town, and also a few accounts, historical accounts that Ari Vanderstoep, the mayor of Orange City and a person very involved in the festival, had produced, as well as something that I found in one of the newspapers that Ed Beloit had written for a presentation he made at the REC in the mid-60s. So the stories are pretty much the same, and they go like this. The backdrop is that we've had successful festivals, tulip festivals in Holland, Michigan in 1929, and Pella had their first festival in May of 1935. all right? So the story went that the Pella Chronicle, the newspaper in Pella, after the festival in Pella, wrote up in glorious detail all of the good things that happened. Now, a man in the community, Dr. Edward Fisher, a veterinarian, was one of the people who read that article. And at one point got on his horse and rode over here and went to talk with Ed Beloit, and went into his office and in effect said to Ed, why can't we do something like this? Why can't we do a festival like they're doing in Pella? And Ed Beloit's response was, well, if you're going to have a tulip festival, you got to have tulips. You need a lot of tulips, many more than what we have here. Rather than just a few yards and, at Slagle's, we need to have tulips everywhere in town. And so that must have inspired both men to realize that perhaps what they needed to do, if they were going to have a festival, was to focus on getting people to buy, plant, and cultivate tulips in town. And so that's what they did. And the way that was organized is that Beloit was invited to the Lions Club that day that Doc Fisher came to his office and sort of made his presentation. They talked about the idea of a festival, and there was a very positive response generally. The way that they were going to make this happen was getting more tulips. That was the first order priority. So they set a goal of trying to order 50,000 bulbs that could be planted in the fall to be available and to come up in the spring. That was one thing they did. Now, it turns out they set the goal of 50,000, and the way that they were going to try to make this happen was to form what was referred to as a 500 club. Now, you joined the 500 club in Orange City if you were one of the people who ordered at least 500 bulbs from Ed Beloit. Now, Ed had experience with people in the Netherlands growing tulips in the Netherlands. He had emigrated from a little town called Lisse, where they grew tulips in that part of the Netherlands. So he had connections on where to find tulips and bulbs, and he found them and negotiated a price of 3 cents a bulb. And then it was a matter of going around to the community and trying to encourage people to buy tulip bulbs, join this 500 club. Now, they set a goal of 50,000, but it fell a little bit short. And best I can tell, numbers were kind of all over the place in the newspaper accounts that I read, but it looked to me like they were successful in getting about 15 to 20,000 bulbs ordered for the fall, for the summer actually, so they could plant them in the fall. So the bulbs were ordered, they arrived in the summer, and in the fall of 1935, under Ed Beloit's tutelage, people started planting them. Put them in the fall as you do and waiting for them to come in the spring. Now, one other little comment that I would make, and this will turn out to be the case because even though they had decided they were going to try to have a tulip festival in May of 1936, there was some complications that were brought about by the fact that the winter of 1936, as many of you can remember, was one for the record books. Snow was up to the eaves of houses, and incredible amounts of snow fell. And with the spring thaw, you can imagine there was flooding. And in fact, best I can tell is that the really serious planning to try to make this May festival happen did not begin until April. So can you imagine doing something for the first time and having a month to do it? Now, they did have a planning committee, as I listed here. George Dunlop was the chair. He represented the Lions. A man named Owen Ross represented the Garden Club. Nora Reinsberger was a lady who represented the Women's Club, and Ed Beloit represented the American Legion. The fact is, though, that they had to throw this together in about a month. And you could imagine this was a challenge to do. One other thing that I would note that I found interesting, and it may be because of the fact they had so little time to plan, that there was no common moniker given to this festival. In reading newspaper accounts, I saw it referred to as the Tulip Day, I heard them call it Spring Festival, and I read that some called it the Festival Day. So it was this first year they kind of stumbled through and tried to name this thing. Regardless of that, what happened on Thursday, May 14th in 1936 was the very first festival. The weather that day, as bad as the winter had been, was absolutely perfect. About 3,500 people came, and if you can imagine, they didn't have a lot of time to promote it, to get the word out and go to communities and do the advertising that's done these days. But 3,500 for the turnout was not bad for the first festival. Now, the program for that first May festival included things that you might recognize from our current festival. One was, of course, they had a parade. They had an afternoon parade. Remember, it was just one day, Thursday. They had an afternoon parade with bands and prizes for the best floats. And they also had a contest for best costume. A lot of people, there was not the emphasis on authentic Dutch costuming in those days. And so in a sense, unless you had brought some clothes from the Netherlands yourself, they sort of had to kind of make up something. So you see some of the Dutch costumes in that first year and first few years were not exceptionally authentic. But there was a contest for that. The best contest with prizes. There was an exhibition of a strong man, a guy who they would put 2x6s on his chest and they'd drive a car over it. And this was to show his strength. That must have been quite interesting to look. There was an exhibition by a really good band in the area, the Lamar's Drum and Bugle Corps. I think I have a photo of that. And being Dutch and being people who like to sing, they had a Frisian sing along, and I think we still see those occasionally. And also there was a band concert by the Orange City High School and the Northwestern Junior College, and it was all capped off in the evening by a performance by the Sioux City Symphony. So that was the program for the very first festival on May 14 in 1936, a Thursday. Now, so let me show you a few visuals with that. This photo right here is of, I believe that band that's marching there, maybe the Lamar's Drum and Bugle Corps. I'm not quite sure, it's a little hard to tell. The thing that's most interesting to me in the early years is that you notice that they are going from south to north down the main drag, which was Washington Street back then and now is Central Avenue. And then they made the turn at the north part of the park and they went around and then they went down Arizona Avenue until they got to the corner of the courthouse, and that was their loop. That was the parade route back in 1936 in a counterclockwise direction compared to the clockwise direction that we see now. Now floats, we sort of use the word float loosely here because some of the floats looked fairly traditional and ones that we would recognize. For example, the one in the foreground here looks to be a decorated truck of some sort that was done by Cambier Motors, which located in town. And then there was one float, you see the one right behind it, that is pulled by a car. Now it turns out that was a float that had the man who was the wooden shoemaker in town, a man named Jacob Van Hoff, and it won first prize. So he was a popular man in the first year, and then they had decorated bicycles behind that. But you get a sort of a sense of what those look like. Now, float, quote unquote, were sometimes quite interesting to look at. This one you can see, was on a farm wagon. It was pulled by a team of horses. And they were sort of trying to make fun with, making sausage and then putting a dog in there and, strange kind of thing. And the only thing that's almost a little embarrassing, my grandfather owned a grocery store in town. And my name is Kalsbeek. And you notice what the sign says. It says Coolbecks. And so I don't know anything about this. Maybe somebody else does. But I wondered if this might be my father and uncle operating this crazy float. All right, now the guy who won first prize for the floats was a man named Jacob Van Hoff. Has anybody heard of the name Jacob Van Hoff before? Okay, some of you have. I don't know if in fact he was the first wooden shoemaker in town, but he looks to have been born sometime in the 1870s, and he died sometime in the 1930s, I believe. So, this would have been in keeping with the time period where we had a wooden shoemaker before Willem Janssen showed up in the mid-1950s. Anyhow, his float won first prize, and you can see he basically took some of his tools and put it on a float. It's a pretty creative little float. And then here's another photo with Mr. Van Hoff and his wife at their shop. Now their shop was located about at where the northwest corner of where the MLC Floyd Valley Elementary School is, right on that block, the intersection of Delaware and First Street. Their shop was right across the street, kind of where, if you know Abe Skibout had a house in that location right across from the school. And that was where their shop was. Now, here's the photo. I want you to be brought back to that first photo I showed you of the store, the hardware store, and I pointed out the pointed wooden shoes. Now, you notice that the wooden shoes that Mr. Van Hoff made, which he's holding in his hand, were pretty pointed. Now, this was somewhat different than the style of Willem Janssen, who had more rounded and more colorful wooden shoes that he made. So it's entirely possible that in that first photo, they were selling Mr. Van Hoff's wooden shoes in the store to people who needed it for their garden. All right, so what else happened in the 1930s? One was that they, it started one day on a Thursday in May 14 of 36, and the next year they had the one-day celebration on a Friday. So they tried a different day of the week. And then starting in 1938 and going really through the 1940s up until 1950, it was a two-day celebration, and it varied sort of when they did it. They did it Thursday, Friday for a while. They tried Friday, Saturday, and so forth. So they kind of experimented with different days. Another thing that they added in the 1930s was in 1937, wooden shoemaking was the first time that it was demonstrated. They set up Mr. Van Hoff downtown, and he could provide an exhibit of his wooden shoemaking. And this, no doubt, was sort of influenced by the fact that he'd been a pretty popular guy with the float competition in the first year. Another thing that came about in 1937 is they're getting more people around town to grow tulips, is that they prepared a map of the area, and I'll show you one from later years a little bit here. But it showed a map of the city of Orange City, the downtown area, and then it indicated where there were houses that had tulips, where people could walk around and see the tulips in Orange City. So tulip viewing around Orange City, that started in 1937. The big addition in 1937 was having a festival queen. The first year they didn't. The idea was probably something that was originated by the fact that when coming from the Netherlands, there was a very popular queen, Wilhelmina, in those days, and this might have provided a sort of an impetus for saying, well, we had a queen in the Netherlands, let's have a queen for our festival also. Another thing added was an antique show. They did show antiques in the windows of the businesses in town in 1936, but they decided it would make more sense to set up an exhibit in a single location. So in 1937, and for many years subsequent, they had an antique show, and it was held in the town hall. Street scrubbing was another thing that was added in 1937. I've got a photo or two to show for that. It's a little different looking than what we see today. And promotion obviously became more important to them as they tried to appeal to more towns in the area to get people to come to the festival. And some of the sort of the central focus of outreach and promotion was this group called the Scutters. This was a group of 10, 15, 20 couples who built a little float, the Scudder boat float, which we still have in our festival today, one of the later versions of it. But in the first version, it was an old truck that they had from Slagle Lumber Company that they made into and looked like a boat. And the Scutters learned some Dutch songs, and they would make trips to promote the festival. We'll see some photos of them in Sioux City, but they went elsewhere and really were sort of the goodwill ambassadors in the early years in trying to promote the festival. Also, later in the 1930s, I mentioned that there was a symphony performance in the first year. Starting in 1938, and for a couple of years, a lawyer in town by the name of A.J. Colline produced and sort of provided the artistic impetus for a nighttime variety show. So 1938 and 1939, there was a show, and I'll show you some things from that. All right, so this is a program bill that they would deposit, put on telephone poles and so forth in other towns as a way to promote. And the thing that's interesting about this was 1939 when one of the Collines programs, the second year called Katrina, was done. But there's something that you probably can't read, it's too small, but the arrow points to a word, stunts. And so what I wanted you to, get this to work, there we go. The first question for you to think about is, what was a Tulip Festival stunt? Okay, what precisely was it? They judged them and they gave prizes for them, but what was a stunt? That's your first question. Now, I mentioned that there was judging of the parade entries and so forth, and what they would typically do is the person organizing the parade would participate as one of the judges, and here we see a man named Lee Barks on the right. He's one of the judges, and those three gentlemen on his right are some businessmen from Sioux City. So they would invite people from other towns, some people of note, to be guest judges, and they would judge the entries to the parade. Now, I mentioned George Dunlop. George was important, I think, to the Tulip Festival in the sense that he provided leadership to the planning committee for many years. He certainly did in 1936, but he, I believe, holds the record of all of those in the community who were the chairman of the steering committee, so to speak. That for 6 years in the 1930s and 40s, he was the man sort of leading the planning committee. And he, of course, is the grandfather of our current mayor. Okay, now I'd also mentioned about trying to promote and inform visitors as to where tulips were grown in town. This is an example from 1941 of a map that was provided to visitors to show them where the people were growing tulips around town. So if they wanted to wander around and see where tulips were, they had a map to guide them in doing so. Now this is an interesting photo in the sense that it depicts the afternoon parade in 1937, the second year now. And the thing that struck me the first time that I saw these types of photos, if you look carefully at the people standing along the sidelines here, there are quite a few of them watching this parade, but notice how they are dressed. You know, you go to the Tulip Festival these days and people are there in shorts and jeans and, everyday clothes and whatever. These people dressed like they were going to church. I mean, it was really quite remarkable to me to see how formally the people dressed. And this suggested to me that they took this event to be pretty serious and that they wanted to, dress it up. So they wore nice clothes. But once again, you can see they're coming south to north, counterclockwise, and the backdrop there you see the village, or the Hawkeye Hotel, and across the street the Benton Hotel, which used to be there. Now this slide from the 1939 festival shows a couple of things. One was that horses were an important part of the parade entries. Not only did they pull floats, but people rode them, and that was sort of part of one of the things that you saw during the parade. The other thing that's important in this photo is to notice that the American Legion is carrying the colors, and how many years haven't we seen that? So that tradition was started very early and carried through to the present day. Okay, get ready for quiz question number 2. I mentioned that we had a Tulip Queen for the first time in 1937, and every year since. Well, in those days also, after the parade had finished, they would have the coronation of the Queen, and the Queen's float would be come to the curb, and the Queen and her court would process across the grass and go to this structure, which was located in the northwest corner of the park, the same place that the building is there now. This was the coronation of Queen Anne Scoop. Elizabeth Topp, I forgot to mention, was our first queen. You probably know that. Queen in 1939 was Anne Scoop, and this was her coronation. And my question is this: pay particular attention to these gentlemen sitting off the side. There are about a dozen of them. My question is this: what important festival responsibility was given to the dozen or so uniformed young men in this 1939 photo? So I'm talking about, what are these guys with the white uniforms and the black boots and all that, looking very sharp unit there? What was their role? What did they do? Okay. This is the most amazing photo I'm going to show you tonight, at least in my book. Why is it amazing? Now, first of all, this is from the 1939 festival. It was a 2-day festival. Attendance, that festival was about 11,000, which was, good. The attendance was continually growing. This is a photo of the crowd attending the coronation ceremony. Now, remember, the coronation was right after the parade. The parade would be coming down the streets, the people standing on the side like we saw. Look at the teeming multitude of people here. I'd love to try to estimate how many people, but that's solid wall-to-wall people here all the way, it looks like, to Main Street. This was amazing, the interest in the coronation in this year to me. That was just incredible. The girls standing on the left there were probably members of the choir that was singing for the coronation. This photo is interesting for a couple of reasons. First, it depicts the way that antiques were displayed in the town hall. And this 1939 would have been one of the first years that they did this. But when you talk about antiques, if you look at what's being displayed there, these are mostly houseware items that either people had brought from the Netherlands and were special to the families, but people would donate those and they put them on display. The thing that was interesting to me was the lady who is displaying them. Theodore England was the person in charge of the theater program at Northwestern College when I was there. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Okay, now I said I had a photo of street scrubbing. This was a photo from 1939. And they're doing things that we normally see in street scrubbing. To me, it was interesting, the size of the brooms, and then notice we got a house broom that was actually being used also, and they look pretty much like the street scrubbers we see of today. I didn't see any yokes that men were carrying. The one guy there has just a large bucket of water. But anyhow, I thought that was kind of an interesting view of the way street scrubbing looked. This is a photo of the Scudder's boat float. The design of the Scudder's boat float really hasn't changed that much over the years. This was the original float that was built, where it was built from an old Slagle's lumber truck that apparently was too old to be useful anymore. And you can see this is during a parade, and you have to look closely here, but it's pretty clear that the people on that float are singing. And what they were singing are Dutch songs that Ed Beloit would have probably taught them. And this was one of their roles, to be a presence during the festival, but also to promote the festival in advance. Now this is the man A.J. Coline I was talking about. I had never heard of him before I looked into all of this, but He was apparently a very creative guy. He was a lawyer in town, and he was the producer and director of the night shows that they had, and interesting night shows they were. The handbill that was used for the night show for this A.J. Colline production here in 1938, which was entitled In Dutch, best I can tell is that the things that were offered are sort of summarized in this little thing you can't read in the middle of the slide. It says sparkling tunes, special scenery, up to the minute laughs, and lots of pretty girls. And the girls is in quotes for reasons you will see. This is the cast of the 1938 production by A.J. Colline. Now, it's hard to see in detail here, but you can see that there are guys who are dressed in Dutch clothes. There are girls dressed in Dutch clothes. There are also some guys dressed in girls' Dutch clothes. So that sort of conjures up the possibility that this was almost sort of a burlesque type of thing. But they did a variety of things, and apparently it was very popular because it lasted a couple of years, and I read a lot of good things about it from the Times. All right, so that was the 1930s. So let's move now on into the 1940s and see what was added then. Well, for one thing, I'd mention that the idea of a two-day Tulip Festival kind of caught on fairly early on. And in the 1940s, you saw it every year that the festival was run, 40, 41, and then 47 through 49. And in the interval in between, I think we all know that there was a break in the festival for 5 years during World War II. Now, just as a little aside on that, it was interesting. I still looked at newspaper accounts in May in those years just to see what was going on. And they were admittedly, patriotic programs, including and encouraging people to buy bonds and so forth. The first year that they did this in 1942, people still came dressed up in Dutch clothes. So there was sort of a smattering of the concept of a Dutch festival, but it was mostly, appropriately tuned to the war effort. Okay, and another thing that happened in the 40s, and I mentioned that 3 days appeared in 1950, and from 1950 on until the present day, it's always been Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. It was a more active, advanced promotion of the festival. Booster trips arised. Who participated in booster trips here? You remember what those were about? They would, I saw for 1 year, it's like they had 4 booster trips. And one night they went to 4 or 5 places west in South Dakota and so forth. Another time they went south to Sioux City and some of the places around there. And then they went into Minnesota another time, and they would go to 5 or 6 different places. The entourage for a booster trip usually included a sound truck, which was simply a car that had a microphone with amplification and then speakers on the roof. Old Home Bread, I remember, was one of them that I saw when I was doing it in the early 1950s. But you'd have the sound truck, and then you have a bunch of caravan of cars, which would have Dutch dancers or members of the Dutch Dozen. And they would come into town, and the announcer would say, "The Dutchmen have arrived here. We'll be headed to your downtown area, and in 15 minutes we'll have a little program for you." And people would come from the town, and they would be entertained a little bit. And then there were the kids, and that was me, that's what I did, had handbills that had little promotionals that say when the festival was, and come on, and so forth. So those were booster trips. Those started in the 50s and went on for maybe a decade or so. There are hoop drills, I'll come back to that. And then Dutch dancing occurred in 1941, but then it was restarted after the war effort in 1947. The person most responsible for the restart of the Dutch dancing in 47 was a lady from Holland, Michigan, the wife of a professor at Hope College, who was brought in as a consultant to choreograph some Dutch dancing. and to pick a tune to dance to. And so that was the role of a woman. I'll feature her a little bit more in a minute. Also appearing in 1947 was the Dutch Dozen. The Dutch Dozen, the dozen girls who perform and do little routines and so forth to the present day, started fairly early on in 1947. It was organized by Mrs. Notenboom, and it was the springboard for that was the fact that the town had to provide entertainment for a church-related conference in town, and so they said, well, let's do something with our Dutch heritage emphasis, and so the Dutch Dozen was formed and stuck, and they appeared at the festival every year since. Okay, so I skipped over hoop drills, didn't talk much about it because that's my third question. So think about the concept of a hoop drill. Who's ever heard of a hoop drill? Anybody? One, okay. What was a hoop drill? All right. All right, so I mentioned that promotion was a bigger deal in the 1940s and 50s. And this photo shows an entourage from Orange City, including the mayor, Ari Vanderstoep, and George Dunlop, you see in the center. And Dan Conley was the mayor of Sioux City. And you can see a whole bunch of people from Orange City went with this entourage and are dressed up and no doubt entertained in some way. And this one from a little later in 1956, in that year, you can see that there must be 30 or so girls who were doing Dutch dance in those days who performed for the people on Nebraska Street in Sioux City. This was in 56. Now, Dutch dancing, as we knew it for many years, started in 1947. And I guess because of the fact there were guys who were sort of slow to come back after World War II, they decided that the Dutch dancing that would happen starting in 1947 with this lady from Michigan, Mrs. Robert Kavanaugh, would consist of all girls. With half of the girls were dressed in boys' costumes and half of the girls in girls' costumes. And here you see from 1947 that entourage of dancers from 1947. Now, you may be curious about where the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Does anybody know where that comes from? I was curious about that too. And I looked into it, and it turns out, and this was information I got from Marcia Sweep, who was a person that was involved in the early days of Dutch dancing in 1947. And it's actually the refrain from a song in the Broadway musical Sweethearts, and the song was Jeanette and Her Little Wooden Shoes. And where you see that red arrow is where that frame begins. And it's a little hard to read, but it says clip, clop, clop, clip, clop, clop over the, I can't read it myself. And then her feet were petite, but you heard her for miles. And it was because she was wearing wooden shoes. But that was the tune from this Broadway musical Sweethearts. And that part forward is what they recorded and has been used for years to dance to for Dutch dance. Now this is a photo that's obviously out of the period I'm talking about. It's from 2010. And I bring it up just to remind everyone that in 1978, after many, many years, we had all-girl Dutch dancing. In 1978, they decided it was time to have guys and girls. But my question is this. Quiz question number 4. Was 1978 the year that men and women first performed Dutch folk dances in Orange City? If not, what festival year was it? Was that the first time that we saw coeducational Dutch dancing? All right, we also needed to show the Dutch Dozen, and here in this photo from 1952, I mentioned that Lida Notenboom was the person who was the organizer of it, but here we see the Dutch Dozen performing in the town hall, as they, I guess, still do today, for the audiences during Tulip Festival. So, my final question, quiz question number 5, was a Tulip Festival parade ever held under the lights? And if so, what year? Have we ever had a Tulip Festival parade where you had the streetlights on? Okay? That was an interesting, when I first found out about this. Well, because as you might suspect, the answer is yes. So let's review our quiz answers. The first question was, what was a Tulip Festival stunt? Stunt. Well, by definition, a stunt was a parade entry consisting of one person or a small group of persons intended to amuse or celebrate some aspect of Dutch heritage. And in this photo you see from 1936, there's a lady there and probably her son and their dog, and the dog is pulling a little wagon, a milk wagon. That was a stunt. It was a small little type of thing, sort of a cameo appearance with a small group. That was a part of the parade, and they marched right through along with all the other entries. Okay, number 2. What important festival responsibility was given to the dozen or so uniformed young men in this 1939 coronation photo? You got it. Somebody said they pulled the float. They pulled the Queen's float. They pulled the Queen's float for many years, and now this was from Bertha Visser, was the year, I forget what year it is, right, 1940. But you can see that, gosh, there must be 20 guys pulling this float. But they had ropes in the front, and these guys would pull them down, Main Street, and that was their job. They were the means of movement for the Queen's float. Okay, quiz question number 3. What were hoop drills? Hoop drills. There you see it. It appeared one year and it never appeared again, to my knowledge. But it involved girls dressed in Dutch clothes, and you can see that they're paired up, and they were holding some sort of a flexible stick that would bend, and all the way on this little stick were looks like tulips. And they would march down the street and they would do different formations. First they're going around and then they're going forward and then they go switch directions and so forth. But they had they had it choreographed in a way to entertain. Unfortunately, like I say, it didn't stick. Okay, quiz question number 4. Was 1978 the year that men and women first performed Dutch folk dances at the Orange City Festival? If not, what festival year was it? Now, the answer to this question was important for me personally because I was amazed to find this out. I thought that you never saw any mixed dancing of couples prior to 1978, when they, the years where they started making the festival more authentic. But in fact, this is a photo from the 1941 festival. Again, remember, this was the year of the hoop drills. And there are people, mixed couples, doing some sort of folk dance. I don't know what music they did this to, but I got this photo from Myrna Van Pelt, Mrs. Ray Van Pelt, and that's Ray, the last guy on the left side, with his teacher from Orange City High School, who twisted his arm to become her partner, and they did some sort of a Dutch folk dance, but it was coeducational, and this was 1941. I remember I was going to put this in the account that I had for the festival book, and everybody just nearly beat me down on this, and they said, that's not possible. It did not happen until 1947, or 1978, but in fact, I showed them this photo that proved it, and I got the photo from Myrna Van Pelt, 1941 festival. Okay, and in fact, you can see, this is the handbill from the 1941 festival. The little red arrow points to, it looks like at 1 o'clock, folk dances downtown area. So it did happen. It did have folk dances that were co-ed. Now the other thing that we're going to see, to answer question number 5, is was a Tulip Festival parade ever held under the lights? Yes. There it is, 1941. It was under the lights. In fact, if you look at the schedule, you can't read it here, but the evening parade began at 8:45. So they did have a festival, and now how they got adequate lighting, I have no idea. Maybe just by street lights, but there it is. Tulip Festival Evening Parade under the lights. Okay, that's it. Yeah, we have a few questions. We have time for questions or observations. So yeah, go ahead.
How many people joined the 500 Club when it was started?
Well, you know, if you take, I'd be estimating here, but remember, 500 Club, you have to have at least order at least 500 bulbs. And I'm estimated they probably had between 15 and 20,000. Let's say it's 20,000. It must have been 30 or 40. So they worked pretty hard to try to get people involved, but they did not get a huge number. You know, their goal was 50,000, and I think they had set a much higher goal in Pella and achieved it. They had over 50,000 bulbs.
But it was a depression.
Say it again?
It was a depression.
It was yeah. Well, this, you know, I didn't, but should have mentioned, another thing that's truly amazing about something like this getting off the ground is that this all happened in one of the toughest period of time in our country's history. I've given a lot of thought as to what it is that would get people to say, you know, we should celebrate our Dutch heritage. And it must have been a very strong sense of connection to some of those things that they really appreciated about the place they left to come to America. That led them to say, we need to celebrate this. We can't forget about it. This was really important to us. Anybody else?
Washington Street was mentioned several times. What street was that now?
That was Central Avenue.
Central.
Yeah, Central Avenue, yeah. You would have seen it if you could have read that one little map that I showed you where all the flowers were. That was very interesting, as it showed me, at least in the late 1930s, what the streets were named back then. And they were quite different. They still had the numbering of, you know, first, second, and third, you know, go on east and west. But the streets that were north and south were quite different. Anyhow, fascinating period of this town in establishing an event like this that, if you look back on it, we have done this 80 times. And every time it's been a little better every time. I mean, it's a real tribute to this community, I believe. Okay, thank you for coming.
Well, we'd really like to thank you, Bill, for your research and your entertaining way of presenting the program. It was very interesting for all of us, I'm sure. I've got a couple of other announcements that I probably want to make right now. And you have an opportunity now, after Bill was talking about the 500 Club. I don't think this will cost you that much, though. We're saying, in keeping with the theme of tonight's Tulips on Parade, we'd love to see Orange City covered in even more tulips. The Orange City Tulip Festival Committee is encouraging everyone to get out and plant tulip bulbs. If you need tulip bulbs, the city will have the previous year's bulbs available for free during the third week of October. And in addition, the Tulip Town Bulb Company will have bulbs available starting around October 1. They are $1 at their shop and are available until they're sold out. So it's a good opportunity, I think. Also, mark your calendars and watch for the reminders, because they will be showing up in the papers about when these bulbs are available. One more thing we'd like to do is thank you from the board members for your continued support of the museum. We're really appreciative of all that you've done for us, and that we're continuing to try to do more things in the future as far as exhibits and telling our story about the Dutch American heritage. Another couple of things. After our next nights at the museum, we will have our annual meeting and election of officers. So If you want to stay around for that, we'd appreciate it. If you don't care to, that's okay too, but we just want to make sure that you're aware that we will have our business meeting after the next nights at the museum. And that will be on, I gotta find it here, October 19th. Dr. Doug Anderson and Greta Grand will be presenting a program entitled Orange City Illustrated. So on that, I'd like to thank Bill again, and thank you all for attending.
You know, we just hope this can